You don't get to sit there. The man's voice cut through the quiet diner like a sudden crack of thunder, loud enough to turn every head before the coffee even finished pouring. And for a moment the entire room seemed to pause as if the air itself had tightened, because the person he was speaking to wasn't arguing, wasn't reacting, wasn't even looking up yet. Just an elderly black man seated alone in a corner booth near the window, his hands resting calmly beside a ceramic mug that still steamed in the early morning light. The kind of quiet presence that usually went unnoticed in places like this. A roadside diner, just off Highway 41, where truckers stopped for eggs and locals gathered for their usual 7 a.m. routine. But now the silence carried weight, and the elderly man finally lifted his eyes slowly, revealing a face shaped by years, steady and composed. The brim of a worn Navy veteran cap casting a soft shadow across his forehead, his jacket faded but clean, his posture straight in a way that spoke of discipline learned long before most of the people in the room had even been born. And still he didn't say a word, because he had seen this before. The assumption, the judgment, the quiet calculation people made when they thought someone didn't belong. The kind that never needed to be explained, only felt. And the man standing across from him shifted impatiently, glancing around as if expecting support, while a few customers exchanged uneasy looks and a waitress froze mid-step with a pot of coffee in her hand, her eyes darting between them, sensing the tension building like a storm rolling in over flat land. The elderly man reached for his mug calmly, as if the moment didn't belong to him at all, as if he had learned long ago that silence could carry more power than reaction. And outside the diner windows, the morning sun stretched across parked pickup trucks and a delivery van idling near the curb, while inside, forks hovered above plates and conversations dissolved into whispers, because something about the stillness of the man in the booth made the moment feel heavier than it should have been, like everyone was waiting for something they couldn't quite name. And the man across from him scoffed, shaking his head, muttering under his breath about respect and space and who deserved to be where. But the elderly veteran remained composed, his fingers resting lightly against the table, his breathing steady, his eyes calm, as though he were measuring not the man in front of him, but the room itself, the people, the atmosphere, the quiet shift happening 1 second at a time. And somewhere near the counter, a young customer slowly pulled out his phone, not to record yet, just to hold, sensing that whatever was about to unfold would matter, because there was something unmistakable about the elderly man's presence, something grounded, something immovable, like he wasn't just sitting in that booth, but anchored there, as if time itself had decided to pause around him. And though no one in the diner knew it yet, the quiet man with the veteran cap wasn't just another customer passing through. He was someone whose story stretched far beyond that small roadside diner. And in just a few minutes, the calm in his eyes would change the entire room. The elderly man did not move from the booth, and that alone seemed to unsettle the room more than anything else, because people expected resistance or apology or at least discomfort, but instead he lifted his mug slowly and took a small sip of coffee, as if the interruption had not earned his attention yet. And the man standing across from him shifted his weight, impatiently glancing around for agreement, while a few regulars at the counter exchanged looks that carried more hesitation than support. Because something about the veteran's calm posture felt deliberate, like he was allowing the moment to unfold rather than reacting to it. And the waitress finally stepped forward, her name tag reading Emily, her voice gentle but uncertain as she asked if everything was all right, though she already sensed that it was not. And the man waved her off with a dismissive gesture, saying that he just wanted the seat cleared because he always sat there on weekday mornings and that he was tired of strangers taking up space in his town, while Emily hesitated, glancing toward the elderly man, who nodded politely, as if acknowledging her presence, before setting his mug back down. Carefully, his movements precise, measured, the kind of control that came from decades of discipline. And Emily noticed the small American flag pin on his jacket and the faded lettering stitched beneath his cap reading Vietnam Veteran, and her expression softened slightly as she said quietly, "Sir, he was here first." But the man standing across the table scoffed louder this time and muttered that it did not matter who got there first, and that respect had to be earned. And the words hung in the air heavier than expected, because the elderly veteran simply looked up again, meeting his eyes without anger, without challenge, just calm, steady acknowledgement. and outside the diner a delivery truck pulled away, leaving the morning quieter than before, while inside the tension thickened like a storm waiting to break, and a man near the counter whispered something to his wife, while another customer folded his newspaper halfway, lowering it just enough to watch. And the veteran finally spoke, his voice low, and even saying, "I have been sitting here for about 15 minutes, and I am almost finished with my coffee," and the simplicity of his tone seemed to shift the energy again, because there was no hostility, only fact, and the man across from him let out a short laugh, glancing around again, searching for reinforcement, but finding less than before, and Emily stepped back slightly, sensing that the moment was balancing on something fragile, while the elderly veteran rested his hands lightly on the table, his fingers steady, his shoulders relaxed, and for a brief second the morning light through the window illuminated the lines on his face like quiet proof of time lived fully, and no one in the diner knew his name yet, but the calm in his voice carried the weight of someone who had learned patience in places far louder than this. And as the silence stretched longer, the man across from him seemed more unsettled by the lack of reaction than any argument could have caused, and a young customer near the register quietly set his phone on the counter screen, facing down, as if waiting, while Emily returned to refill coffee cups, her movements slower now, her eyes occasionally drifting back toward the booth, because something about the veteran's stillness suggested that the moment was not ending, but building towards something none of them could see yet. And the elderly man lifted his mug again, calmly unaware to everyone else that the quiet morning in that small roadside diner was about to shift in a way no one inside would forget. The man standing beside the booth shifted again, but now the room had changed, and he seemed to feel it, because fewer eyes supported him and more watched quietly, measuring the moment, as the elderly veteran remained seated calm and composed, his hand resting near the coffee mug, while Emily returned to the counter, yet kept glancing back, sensing the tension rising like pressure inside a sealed room. And the man let out a frustrated breath, then spoke louder than before, saying that people like him should know better than to take seats meant for regulars, and the words carried further than he expected, echoing lightly across the tiled floor as forks slowed and conversations faded again. And the veteran lifted his gaze once more, not with anger, but with the steady calm that made the silence heavier, and he said quietly, "I am only finishing my coffee, and then I will be on my way." And the simplicity of his response seemed to unsettle the man even more, because it denied him the conflict he seemed to expect. And a middle-aged customer near the window cleared his throat, as if considering whether to speak, while another woman seated at the counter shook her head softly under her breath. And Emily stepped forward again, her voice careful, as she asked if anyone needed refills, attempting to ease the tension, but no one responded, because the focus remained locked on the booth near the window. And outside, a pickup truck rolled into the parking lot, gravel crunching faintly beneath its tires, while inside the elderly veteran adjusted his jacket slightly, revealing the small service ribbons stitched carefully along the inside lining. And Emily noticed them, her expression shifting with quiet recognition, though she did not speak yet. And the man standing beside the booth glanced at the jacket as well, then quickly looked away, as if unsure what to make of it. And a younger customer near the register leaned toward his friend, whispering that the veteran looked familiar, though he could not place why. In the room seemed to hold its breath again, while the veteran reached into his pocket, slowly pulling out a folded receipt, placing it neatly beside his mug, as if marking the end of his visit with quiet dignity, and his movements remained precise, unhurried, like someone accustomed to patience and discipline. And the man beside him finally muttered that he did not understand why the situation had to take so long, but his voice lacked the earlier confidence. And Emily stepped closer, now her tone slightly firmer, as she said, "He is almost finished," and the statement shifted the room further, as several customers nodded subtly, while the elderly veteran lifted his mug one final time, the morning light reflecting softly off the ceramic surface, and for a moment the tension seemed ready to dissolve, yet something about the stillness suggested otherwise, because the veteran's calm presence continued to anchor the room. And the man standing beside him hesitated, glancing once more around the diner, realizing that the atmosphere had turned against him. And in that quiet pause, the distant sound of a passing siren drifted faintly from the highway outside, barely noticeable, yet strangely timed, as if the morning itself were signaling that the calm inside the diner was only temporary, and that something larger was quietly approaching. While the elderly veteran placed his mug down gently, and folded his hands on the table, waiting with the patience of someone who understood that sometimes the most powerful moments arrived not with noise, but with silence. Emily set the coffee pot down slowly, and this time she did not step back behind the counter because something in her expression had shifted from uncertainty to quiet resolve, and she looked at the man standing beside the booth before speaking carefully, saying, "He is a veteran," and her words carried softly across the diner, but they landed with unexpected weight because several customers lifted their heads at once, and the man glanced at her with a dismissive shrug, saying that it did not change anything, while Emily shook her head gently and added, "He served this country, and that should mean something." And the elderly veteran remained still, his hands folded calmly on the table, his posture steady, as though he had heard these conversations before and chosen long ago not to interrupt them. And a woman near the window nodded slowly, while a truck driver seated at the counter leaned back in his stool and murmured that she was right, and the shift in the room grew stronger as more customers turned their attention toward the booth and the man standing beside it seemed to sense the change because his voice softened slightly, though his tone remained defensive, and he muttered that he was only asking for his usual seat, but the conviction in his words had weakened, and Emily stepped a little closer, her voice more confident now, saying that the gentleman had been polite and had not caused any trouble, and that he was nearly finished. And the elderly veteran lifted his eyes, briefly acknowledging her with a small nod that carried quiet gratitude without needing words, and the truck driver spoke again, this time louder, saying, "Let the man finish his coffee," and the room seemed to settle further into that direction, while the man beside the booth hesitated, glancing around, realizing the support he expected had faded, and the elderly veteran reached for his receipt again, folding it carefully before placing it beside his mug, his movements unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. And a young customer near the register finally picked up his phone, not to record, but to check the time while watching the scene unfold. And outside, the morning sun rose higher, casting longer streaks of light across the diner floor, and Emily noticed the veteran's hands steady and calm resting on the table, and she asked softly if he needed anything else, and he replied quietly, "No thank you, just finishing my coffee," and his voice carried the calm of someone who had endured far louder moments than this. And the man standing beside him shifted once more, then stepped slightly back as if reconsidering the situation, and the truck driver gave a faint nod of approval, while the woman near the window returned to her meal, though she continued to watch from the corner of her eye, and the tension that once filled the diner began to loosen but not disappear entirely, because something about the veteran's quiet presence still suggested that the morning was not over. And as Emily returned toward the counter, she glanced once more at the veteran, noticing the calm in his expression and the faint reflection of sunlight across his veteran cap, and though no one in the diner fully understood it, yet the quiet defense offered by a single voice had begun to change the entire atmosphere, and the elderly veteran remained seated, composed and patient, as if he knew that sometimes the smallest acts of fairness were the first signs that something larger was about to unfold. The diner slowly returned to the rhythm of morning again, but the calm felt fragile, as if the moment had only paused instead of ended, and the elderly veteran lifted his mug for what seemed like the final sip, while the sunlight through the window warmed the table in front of him, and Emily wiped the counter in quiet glances, watching the booth, with a subtle sense that the morning still held something unresolved. And the man who had been standing beside the table took a step back, yet did not leave completely, instead lingering near the aisle as though unsure whether to retreat or continue. And the truck driver returned to his breakfast, but kept one eye lifted, while the woman near the window folded her napkin slowly, and the veteran placed his mug down gently, then reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small folded photograph worn at the edges, and he looked at it briefly, his expression softening in a way that contrasted with the tension still lingering in the room. And though no one else could see the image, it carried the quiet weight of memory, and for a brief second the diner seemed to fade from his focus as his mind drifted years back to a younger version of himself, standing in uniform beneath a wide, open sky, the sound of rotor blades in the distance, the heat pressing down, and the sense of duty that had shaped decades of his life. And he remembered returning home years later, walking into places like this, hoping for ordinary mornings, only to find that sometimes the hardest battles were not the ones fought far away, but the quiet moments where dignity was tested in silence. and he folded the photograph, carefully placing it back into his pocket, his posture returning to calm composure, as though the past had simply passed through him like a quiet wind. And Emily noticed the change in his expression and approached softly, asking if he would like a refill, and he shook his head politely, saying, "No thank you, I am finished now." And he reached for his wallet, slowly placing cash beside the receipt, his movements precise, respectful, while the man lingering near the aisle glanced again, uncertain now, as if reconsidering the entire situation, and the truck driver spoke quietly to the woman beside him, saying he handled that better than most would, and she nodded in agreement, and the veteran slid his wallet back into his jacket, then rested his hands briefly on the table, as though preparing to stand, yet he paused, looking toward the window, where the morning had fully settled across the parking lot. And in that quiet pause, the faint rumble of vehicles passing along the highway drifted through the glass, and Emily stepped aside, giving him space while the room seemed to hold another breath, and the veteran finally reached for the edge of the table, beginning to rise slowly, his movements steady and deliberate, the calm of someone who had spent a lifetime carrying himself with quiet dignity. And though the tension had softened, there remained an unspoken sense that the story unfolding in that small roadside diner had not yet reached its turning point, and the elderly veteran stood composed, his veteran cap catching the morning light, as if the next moment was already waiting just beyond the silence. The elderly veteran rose slowly from the booth, his movements steady and deliberate as the quiet diner watched, without fully realizing why the moment felt heavier than a simple departure, and he adjusted his jacket, gently smoothing the fabric, before placing a few bills on the table beside the receipt, while Emily stepped closer, offering a small respectful nod, and he returned it with calm courtesy, saying thank you for the coffee and the kindness, and his voice carried warmth without drawing attention to itself. And as he turned toward the aisle, the man who had lingered earlier shifted aside, giving him space now, without speaking, while the truck driver lifted his cup slightly in acknowledgement, and the veteran gave a faint nod in return, his posture upright as he moved toward the counter. And outside, the morning sun reflected off windshields in the parking lot, creating soft flashes of light that drifted across the diner walls, and Emily reached for the cash, preparing to ring it in, but the veteran paused near the counter, reaching slowly into his pocket and pulling out a simple flip phone worn from years of use. And he opened it calmly, as if making an ordinary call, though something about the timing drew quiet attention from those nearby, and he stepped slightly toward the window, lowering his voice, but not enough to escape the stillness in the room. And he spoke gently, saying, "Daniel, it is me." And there was a pause, as if listening while the room remained quiet, without understanding why the simple phone call carried weight. And he continued calmly, saying, "I am all right, but I thought you should know something unusual happened this morning." And his tone remained measured, never accusatory, never dramatic, and he listened again, nodding slightly, while Emily glanced toward him, curious, and the truck driver leaned subtly to hear without appearing obvious, and the veteran spoke again, saying, "No, there is no need to worry. I am finishing up here, and I will be leaving shortly." And then after another pause, he added quietly, "I know you are busy, but I thought you would want to be aware," and his calm voice carried the discipline of someone accustomed to speaking with purpose, and as he closed the phone gently, he slipped it back into his pocket without ceremony and turned toward the door, while the man near the aisle watched him go, now completely silent, and the veteran moved toward the exit, each step unhurried, his veteran cap catching the light as he passed through the diner. And Emily felt a subtle sense that something larger had just begun, even though nothing dramatic had occurred. And outside, a distant line of vehicles moved along the highway, the faint hum drifting through the glass, and the veteran reached for the door handle, pausing for a brief moment as though measuring the morning air beyond it. And inside the diner, the calm returned, yet carried an undercurrent of anticipation, because though no one knew exactly why the simple phone call had shifted the atmosphere, the quiet certainty in his voice suggested that the story unfolding in that small roadside diner had only just reached its turning point. The door opened slowly, and the elderly veteran stepped outside into the morning sunlight, the air cool, with the faint scent of asphalt warming under the rising sun, while inside the diner, the quiet hum of conversation cautiously resumed, though several customers still watched through the window as he moved across the parking lot with calm, deliberate steps. And Emily wiped the counter, but her eyes drifted toward the glass, sensing the lingering weight of his presence even after he had stepped outside. And the truck Driver leaned slightly to look past the window blinds just as a distant sound rolled softly down the highway, at first barely noticeable, then gradually growing clearer as multiple vehicles approached in formation, their engines low but steady, and the veteran paused near the edge of the parking lot, his posture unchanged, as if he had expected something without needing to look back, and the first dark SUV turned off the highway, followed by another, then a third, each moving with quiet precision before pulling into the lot and slowing to a stop. And inside the diner, the conversations faded again as customers noticed the vehicles arriving, and the man who had lingered earlier stepped closer to the window, his expression shifting from curiosity to uncertainty, while Emily placed the coffee pot down slowly, sensing the atmosphere tightening once more, and the doors of the SUVs opened, and several individuals stepped out dressed in dark suits, their movements calm, coordinated, scanning the surroundings with quiet professionalism, and one of them spoke briefly into a small device near his collar, while another looked toward the elderly veteran who remained still beside his modest sedan, and the room inside the diner grew silent as the realization began to ripple through the customers, though no one yet understood what they were witnessing, and the truck driver muttered under his breath that this did not look ordinary, while the woman near the window set down her fork, her attention fixed on the scene outside, and the suited individuals moved respectfully toward the veteran, not hurried, not aggressive, simply purposeful, and one of them approached with a slight nod and spoke quietly, while the veteran listened, his expression calm, unchanged, and after a brief exchange, another black sedan rolled into the parking lot slower than the others, its tinted windows reflecting the morning light, and as it came to a stop, the door opened, and a tall man stepped out, adjusting his suit jacket, his posture confident yet composed, and he looked across the lot toward the elderly veteran with immediate recognition. And inside the diner, Emily felt a chill of anticipation as the tall man walked forward, his steps steady and respectful, and when he reached the veteran, he paused briefly, then spoke softly enough that only the nearest individuals could hear, yet the tone carried unmistakable authority, and the veteran gave a small nod as if greeting someone familiar, and the suited individual stepped slightly back, creating quiet space around them, while inside the diner the man near the window whispered, asking who that was, but no one answered because the atmosphere had shifted entirely, and the morning that had begun as an ordinary stop along the highway now carried the unmistakable presence of something far beyond the small roadside diner. And as the tall man turned slightly toward the entrance, the sunlight caught the badge clipped discreetly beneath his jacket, and in that moment the calm certainty in the elderly veteran's earlier phone call began to make sense to everyone watching from behind the glass. The tall man approached the elderly veteran with quiet respect and stopped just a few feet away, his expression softening as he spoke in a calm, steady voice, saying, "Dad, I came as soon as I heard," and the word carried farther than expected, reaching the ears of those watching from inside the diner, and Emily felt her breath catch slightly as the realization began to form, while the suited individuals maintained their positions with professional calm, and the veteran nodded gently, his demeanor unchanged, as if this meeting were as ordinary as the morning coffee he had just finished. And the tall man turned slightly, scanning the area, his presence composed yet unmistakably authoritative, and one of the agents stepped forward, quietly briefing him in low tones, while he listened with measured attention, and then his gaze shifted toward the diner entrance, and he began walking toward it, his steps steady and deliberate, and inside the diner the silence returned completely as customers watched the door with growing anticipation, and the man who had lingered earlier stepped back from the window, uncertainty now visible in his posture, while Emily placed both hands lightly on the counter, sensing that something significant was unfolding, and the door opened, and the tall man entered the diner accompanied by one agent who remained near the entrance, while he moved forward calmly, his presence filling the room without raising his voice, and he looked around briefly, then spoke in a respectful tone, asking if anyone here had interacted with the gentleman outside, and the truck driver nodded slowly, while Emily stepped forward, explaining quietly that the veteran had only been finishing his coffee and had remained calm throughout the morning, and the tall man listened carefully, then nodded in appreciation before speaking again, his voice steady and professional, saying, "My name is Daniel Carter. I serve as head of Homeland Security, and I came because the gentleman outside is my father." And the words settled into the room like still air after a storm, and several customers exchanged glances while the man near the aisle lowered his gaze, and Emily felt a quiet sense of astonishment as the moment fully unfolded and Daniel Carter continued calmly, saying, "My father rarely asks for anything, but when he does I make sure to listen," and he glanced briefly around the diner, his expression composed yet firm, and the truck driver nodded again, while the woman near the window folded her napkin slowly, absorbing the significance of the moment, and Daniel Carter thanked Emily for her kindness before turning back toward the door, and as he stepped outside again the agents maintained their calm positions, while the elderly veteran remained near his vehicle. His posture relaxed, and the atmosphere in the diner shifted completely, now filled with quiet respect as the customers watched through the window, realizing that the calm dignity they had witnessed moments earlier belonged to a man whose quiet presence carried far more than anyone had expected, and the morning sun reflected off the dark vehicles as the veteran and his son stood together speaking calmly, while inside the diner the silence lingered longer than before because everyone understood that the quiet morning had transformed into a moment they would remember long after the coffee cups had been cleared. The elderly veteran and his son stood beside the modest sedan as the morning sun climbed higher, casting long reflections across the parking lot, while the agents maintained a respectful distance, their presence calm and controlled, and Daniel Carter listened quietly as his father spoke in a measured tone, describing the morning not with frustration, but with the calm clarity of someone who had learned long ago that dignity did not require raised voices, and Daniel nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful before placing a gentle hand on his father's shoulder, a simple gesture of respect that carried more meaning than words. And inside the diner, customers remained near the windows watching as the quiet scene unfolded outside, and Emily rested her hands on the counter, her eyes fixed on the father and son standing together, while the truck driver shook his head softly, as if absorbing the lesson without needing to say it aloud, and the man who had lingered earlier stepped back from the window, his posture subdued now, as the weight of the moment settled across the room, and outside Daniel Carter spoke again, his tone calm, yet firm, saying that respect should never depend on appearance, and his father nodded slightly, his eyes steady and composed, and after a brief exchange Daniel stepped back, signaling subtly to the agents, who began moving toward their vehicles with quiet efficiency, while the elderly veteran reached for his car door, pausing briefly as he glanced back toward the diner, and through the glass Emily met his gaze, offering a small respectful nod, and he returned it with the faintest smile before opening the door and settling into the driver's seat, and the engines of the dark vehicles started one by one, the low hum blending into the quiet morning as Daniel Carter gave one final nod to his father before stepping back